Hey guys, tonight we sink into the dusty air of the American frontier. You can almost hear it now, the crunch of gravel beneath your boots, the creak of a saloon sign swaying in the breeze, and that faint smell of coal smoke drifting from a passing train. The Wild West stretches out around you, a vast horizon of dirt streets and wooden shacks where tumbleweeds roll like nervous little spectators. It's a place full of opportunity, danger, and, surprisingly, loneliness. You probably won't survive this, at least not without someone to keep you company. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it right now for you? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into a western boomtown, your boots already coated in layers of dust. The main street is alive with men, miners, ranchers, gamblers and drifters, all swarming like bees around saloons and general stores. The sound of hammers echoes from half-built storefronts, and the air buzzes with voices carrying the accents of every corner of America and even beyond. But what you notice most is who isn't there. Women are scarce. This imbalance wasn't just a minor quirk, it was a full-blown demographic crisis. In some mining towns, the ratio of men to women could be 10 to 1, sometimes worse. Imagine standing in a crowded saloon packed with sweaty men, every one of them eyeing the single barmaid as if she were the last slice of birthday cake at a kid's party. Historians still argue whether this imbalance happened purely because men were drawn to mining and ranching, or if women actively avoided such rough places. But either way, the result was the same: towns bursting with restless bachelors who had more whiskey bottles than meaningful conversation. Think about it. These were men who worked 10-hour days digging ore out of the earth or herding cattle across barren plains. At night, their options for company were limited to poker games, gunfights, or the occasional less-than-legal establishments tucked behind swinging doors. Sure, that might sound like a decent Friday night for some, but year after year, it grew unbearably empty. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some of these lonely men actually held dances where they'd hire each other to pretend to be women, just so they could practice waltzing and remember what it was like to hold someone close. You picture burly miners in patched shirts awkwardly spinning each other around under lantern light. It's funny until you realize the desperation underneath. The scarcity of women also gave rise to what you might call frontier economics. Any woman who did make it westward was instantly elevated in social status. School teachers, laundresses, even widows, suddenly they were the most sought-after people in town. A woman could step off a train in Denver or Deadwood and be courted by 5 suitors before she even reached the depot exit. Men would compete for attention with gifts, offers of land, or promises to build a proper house. Though proper usually meant a drafty log cabin with maybe one window. But let's be real, even the most charming cowboy couldn't fill the statistical void. For every woman who dared the trip, there were dozens of men still left without prospects. The imbalance grew more glaring as towns expanded, and so quietly at first, the idea began to surface. What if companionship could be imported, arranged, or even advertised? What if the West could borrow wives from the East? At this early stage, it wasn't an industry, it was more like a whisper. Men would write home to their sisters or cousins, pleading, "Send me someone who can cook, someone who can sew, someone who can stand the wind." Families back east would nod knowingly because they, too, were burdened with daughters and sisters who faced their own kind of loneliness, crowded cities, few job opportunities, and the looming shadow of spinsterhood if they didn't marry by a certain age. Here's where your modern brain kicks in, though. You imagine setting up a dating profile, except the profile is scrawled in ink, folded into an envelope, and carried across the plains by horseback, riverboat, and eventually rail. The stakes were much higher. There was no swiping left, only the possibility of a brand new life or a miserable gamble. As the imbalance worsened, towns started to notice. Some community leaders even campaigned for civilizing influences, which was polite code for "please send women before we all turn into feral wolves." Newspapers in the East published reports about frontier life with that familiar blend of horror and fascination. They described both the opportunities and the dangers, painting the West as a place where a woman could either find adventure or regret it deeply. One mainstream historical fact underscores just how tilted things were. In 1850, California's population was nearly 90% male. 90%. Entire towns resembled bachelor dormitories. No wonder the spark for mail-order brides began to glow. As you stroll down that frontier street in your imagination, you can feel it, the restless energy of men who had carved out a rough existence but were missing the softer edges of home. They wanted family conversation, laughter in the evenings instead of the clink of whiskey glasses, and while the West was full of gold, cattle, and land, it was heartbreakingly empty of wives. And so, out of this imbalance, a new and peculiar chapter in American history was about to unfold, one where love, marriage, and survival all got tangled up in the dusty letters of strangers. You follow that dusty main street a little further, the boardwalk creaking under your steps, and you catch sight of a cluster of men hunched together outside the saloon. Their hats are tipped low, boots worn thin, and faces shaded by weeks of stubble. Each one carries the same expression, half hopeful, half haunted. These are the miners, ranchers, and drifters who made the Wild West what it was: hard-working, rough living, and desperately lonely. By day, the miner toils underground, chipping away at veins of silver or gold that may or may not exist. The rancher rides for miles across endless prairie, chasing after stray cattle and sleeping under skies so wide they almost swallow him. When the sun sets, both men end up in the same place: a bare cot, a tin plate of beans, and silence. You start to see why a letter from a woman, even just a few lines of ink, could feel more precious than the dusted gold nuggets tucked in a pouch. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Miners sometimes named their favorite tools as if they were sweethearts. Pickaxes got names like Jenny or Maggie, and shovels were treated like faithful companions. One even wrote in his journal, "Maggie never talks back and she never spends my money." That's both funny and a little heartbreaking. An entire emotional world poured into an object that couldn't possibly return it. Historians still argue whether these men were driven west more by opportunity or by escape. Some were young and single, lured by adventure. Others had fled broken marriages, debts, or scandals back east. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. They ended up in communities of men, surrounded by poker tables, gun racks, and a scarcity of affection. Imagine a Saturday night in one of these towns. You push open the swinging saloon doors and the air hits you. Stale beer, wood smoke, and the sour sweat of men who haven't bathed in a week. The piano bangs out a tune, and a barmaid weaves between tables with a tray of cheap whiskey. 10 men lean toward her at once, each hoping for a smile. She knows the power she holds, but also the risk. Too much kindness, and fights break out. Too little, and she risks her job. And when the night ends, the rancher stumbles back to his shack. He lights a kerosene lamp, stares at the log walls, and wonders what it might be like to hear a woman's laughter instead of coyotes howling. It wasn't just about romance. These men craved normalcy. They longed for meals shared across a table, someone to darn socks, someone to fuss about muddy boots left by the door. They longed for family. Some men tried to fill the void by sending for relatives. Brothers rode east, begging sisters or cousins to come west. "You'll find a husband within a week," they promised. And often they weren't wrong. One woman stepping off the train could have her pick of suitors before her luggage hit the ground. But not every family had a spare daughter to send, and not every woman wanted to gamble her safety for adventure. Others turned to less respectable options. Saloons often doubled as brothels, and travelling dance hall girls followed boom towns like moths to flame. But that only sharpened the ache. These encounters were fleeting, transactional, and left men hungrier than before. It wasn't affection they were buying, it was a pale imitation of companionship. Think about the landscape these men lived in. Harsh winters, brutal summers, locust swarms, and dust storms that blackened the sky. Alone, it was unbearable. With a partner, it might be survivable. That calculation, the difference between going mad in silence and building a life with someone, drove men to extraordinary lengths. Here's the mainstream fact. In 1860, census records show that in many frontier counties, women made up less than 20% of the population. That's like having a high school dance where 9 out of 10 people are standing awkwardly on one side of the gym, waiting for the lucky few on the other side. And so letters began to circulate. Not yet the organized mail-order bride system we think of today, but whispers passed from bunkhouse to bunkhouse. "Write home. Place an ad. Someone out there is looking too." You picture a miner dipping his pen, struggling to form the words, his handwriting jagged from calloused hands. "Dear madam," he begins, unsure whether to describe his homestead or his aching loneliness first. The loneliness became so palpable that even preachers and town councils got involved. They believed the arrival of women would stabilize these towns, calm the bar fights, and even boost the economy. After all, a married man bought more furniture, more fabric, and maybe even invested in a schoolhouse. Women weren't just companions, they were civilization itself. And so, night after night, the men lay on their cots, listening to the wind rattle through the cracks in the walls, staring at the empty chair across the room. The silence pressed down heavier than the Montana snow. Somewhere back east, thousands of women were also staring at empty rooms, wondering if there was more to life than crowded tenements and factory shifts. Two groups of lonely hearts, separated by thousands of miles of dirt, dust, and danger, soon to find each other through ink and envelopes. You settle yourself into that wooden chair on the frontier, the lamplight flickering across rough plank walls, and picture the moment when a new idea begins to take shape. If letters can carry news of gold strikes and cattle prices, why not carry messages of the heart? That's when the first advertisements start to appear, tucked between notices about stagecoach arrivals and farm equipment sales. At first, they're modest, just a line or two in a small-town paper. Respectable young man with farm near Omaha seeks lady correspondent, view to matrimony. It looks almost quaint now, but to the rancher who penned it, this wasn't just words, it was survival, maybe even salvation. For the cost of a postage stamp, he might reach someone 3 states away who was tired of boarding houses, dreary mills, or crowded tenements. You can almost hear the paperboy calling out the headlines, his voice cracking as he announces mining yields and local gossip. But tucked on page 4 in that thin column where nobody expected romance, something strange stirs. It's not a love poem, but it's close. A stranger's hand reaching across the void. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Some of the earliest ads weren't placed by men at all, but by enterprising editors hoping to sell more copies. They'd invent lonely bachelors, printing fake profiles just to make their papers more popular with curious readers. A frontier version of clickbait, you could say. Historians still argue whether these phantom ads were harmless fun, or if they crossed into deception that wasted real women's hopes. Either way, they laid the groundwork for what soon became a serious business. For the men, placing an ad was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Imagine sliding your hard-earned coin across the counter, handing the editor a scrap of paper with your words. How do you describe yourself? Owns 40 acres and 2 oxen. Sounds practical, but not exactly romantic. Good with a fiddle, decent cook. Better, but perhaps too humble. Some exaggerated, of course. A dirt floor cabin became a sturdy home, a mule became a fine horse. And women back east, savvy readers that they were, often knew how to read between those lines. For women, seeing these ads was like hearing a door creak open to a whole new world. In Boston or New York, opportunities for marriage were shrinking. Too many men had gone west already. Women outnumbered eligible men, and the ones who stayed were often either too poor or too picky. A young woman working in a textile mill might look at an ad and wonder, could this be her chance to escape the choking smoke, the deafening machines, and the prospect of lifelong spinsterhood? One mainstream fact drives this point home. By the mid-19th century, industrial cities in the East had a surplus of women. Immigrant men often married quickly, but native-born women faced dwindling prospects. The West, on the other hand, had the opposite problem. It was like nature itself was nudging the two sides toward each other through the magic of newsprint. Think of the thrill when the first letters came back in response. A rancher in Kansas receives a neatly folded envelope bearing a Boston postmark. His hands, calloused from reins and rope, tremble as he breaks the seal. Inside, a careful script introduces him to a woman who has never seen a prairie, never smelled sagebrush, never stared up at a sky untouched by factory smoke. She is curious, maybe daring, maybe desperate. And here's a scene for you. A group of men gather in the bunkhouse, one of them clutching a letter. He clears his throat and reads aloud the words of a woman hundreds of miles away. The others lean in, half teasing, half jealous, their eyes shining at the thought that maybe, just maybe, there's hope for them too. Of course, not every ad was honest and not every reply sincere. Some women sought adventure but had no intention of marriage. Some men were looking for housekeepers disguised as wives, and yet for all the risks the system began to grow. Editors noticed the spike in subscriptions when matrimonial ads ran, and soon entire columns were devoted to personals. By the late 1800s, some newspapers even specialized in matrimonial arrangements, shipping love across the continent like any other commodity. Picture it. Two people who had never spoken, never met, were suddenly trading stories of family, dreams, and fears. They sketched themselves in words, hoping the person on the other end could see past the ink into something true. A farmer might describe the golden wheat fields that stretched from his doorstep. A woman might confess how tired she was of city noise and how she longed for quiet. Between them stretched thousands of miles, but also, possibly, a future. And if you're wondering, yes, some of these paper courtships worked. Couples who had only exchanged a handful of letters ended up marrying, raising families, and telling their grandchildren about how it all started with a simple newspaper ad. Others? Well, those stories get interesting, and we'll get there soon. For now, just imagine yourself sitting by the lamp light, ink smudging your fingers as you write to someone you've never seen. The gamble is enormous, but so is the hope. And as the West waits in silence, the first seeds of a mail-order marriage industry are quietly sprouting in the margins of the daily press. You can almost feel the crinkle of paper between your fingers as you follow the trail of these first advertisements into the parlors and kitchens of the East. Imagine a young woman sitting at a small wooden desk, the evening lamp glowing faintly through the haze of coal smoke outside. She has ink on her sleeve, the day's factory work still clinging to her hair, and in front of her lies a newspaper clipping mailed by a cousin or friend. The ad reads something like, "Farmer, age 29, steady and honest, desires correspondence with respectable lady of good character, object matrimony." For many women, those words were electrifying. Back east, life could feel like a narrowing hallway. You worked long hours in textile mills or as a seamstress, bent over your stitching until your back ached. The pay was meagre, the air stifling, and the city loud and unkind. If you were too old, which often meant your late 20s, you risked being labelled a spinster. And with fewer men around, thanks to westward migration, the odds weren't in your favour. So when an ad promised land, a husband, and a chance at family, some women leaned closer to the page. Here's your quirky tidbit. A few even kept scrapbooks of these ads, cutting them out and pasting them into journals as if they were auditioning possible futures. It was the 19th century version of browsing Zillow and Tinder at the same time. Historians still argue whether women saw the West primarily as an escape from industrial drudgery or as a daring adventure. Was it necessity or a hunger for something wild and new? Letters from the period suggest it was often both. "I long for air untainted by smoke," one woman wrote to her prospective husband. Another confessed, "My hands are calloused from factory work, so I reckon I can hold a plough if need be." Practical, yes, but tinged with yearning. You can picture the moment a woman first drafts her reply. The scratch of the quill, the nervous pause as she debates what to reveal. Should she admit she has no dowry? Should she boast of her cooking? Or should she dare to write something flirtatious? Each word is weighed like gold dust. One letter might change the course of her life forever. Meanwhile, family reactions ranged from horror to encouragement. Some fathers scoffed, unwilling to send daughters into what they saw as wilderness. Mothers fretted about safety, picturing their daughters at the mercy of outlaws or wild animals. But siblings often whispered encouragement. After all, wasn't it better than a lifetime of boarding houses and dead-end jobs? One mainstream fact helps explain this momentum. By the mid-1800s, women in cities like Boston and Philadelphia outnumbered men significantly. Census records show imbalances as high as 120 women for every 100 men. That meant, statistically, thousands of women would never marry if they stayed put. The ads dangled a solution, risky though it was. Imagine two parallel evenings, a rancher by his lamplight describing the smell of prairie grass and the sound of coyotes at night, and a woman in a cramped tenement writing back that she longs for skies unbroken by smokestacks. Neither has seen the other's face, neither knows if the words are true, but both are daring to believe. Of course, cynics existed. Newspapers sometimes ran editorials mocking these paper romances. Cartoons portrayed men being tricked by scheming women, or women shocked when their wealthy landowner turned out to be a man with one mule and a shack. Yet the letters kept flowing, and the pile of folded envelopes on postmasters' desks grew taller each week. Here's a scene for you. A young woman boards a train to visit her cousin in another city. In her satchel, hidden beneath embroidery, is a letter from a man she has never met. She pulls it out between stations, rereads his description of sunsets over the Rockies, and feels her heart race. Around her, no one suspects she's considering leaving everything she knows behind. And here's the kicker. Not all women saw themselves as simply answering an ad. Some took initiative, placing ads of their own. Young woman, industrious, seeks honest gentleman of steady habits, object matrimony. You might laugh at the phrasing, but remember, it was bold. It was a declaration that she deserved a chance at love, too. As more women responded, a curious buzz spread through both East and West. Friends whispered about cousins who had written letters. Preachers sometimes frowned, warning against reckless unions, while others secretly encouraged it, hoping it would stabilize the West. and through it all, the mailbags bulged with folded dreams, carried by trains that seemed to shrink the continent, one delivery at a time. Back east, these women stared out of cramped windows at soot-stained brick walls. Out west, men leaned against corral fences, gazing at horizons that felt endless and empty. Between them stretched not just miles, but the beginnings of something entirely new, a postal pathway toward partnership. The lamp flickers low as you watch the words on the page stretch into long, aching sentences. These paper courtships are not dashed off quickly, they are labors of imagination. A man in Montana may take an entire evening to describe his cabin, carefully sketching in words the way the sun drops behind the mountains or how the wind hisses across the tall grass. He knows his penmanship is clumsy, that his spelling falters, but he hopes she will see past the rough edges and glimpse the life he's offering. And somewhere back east, a woman folds her apron, sits at her tiny desk, and replies in neat, looping script. Her letters often overflow with details, perhaps about her family's Sunday dinners, her fondness for novels, or her dislike of factory whistles. She wants him to know she is more than just another name. She is a person who laughs, who dreams, who fears. You can almost hear the sound of envelopes sliding into a leather mailbag, each one carrying a thread of longing stitched across the continent. In the time it took a letter to cross from Missouri to Massachusetts, weeks might pass. And yet that slowness gave the words a kind of weight. Every sentence was reread, savoured, stored under pillows like keepsakes. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some men enclosed little tokens in their letters, pressed flowers from the prairie, a lock of horsehair tied with string, even small nuggets of ore from their mines. Women in return sometimes sent embroidered handkerchiefs or a photograph printed in sepia. One miner joked in a letter that the photo he received was so worn from my pocket that the lady now resembles a ghost, but I still carry her. Historians still argue whether these exchanges built genuine affection or simply papered over desperation. Was it love, or was it survival dressed up in romance? Perhaps both. Some couples wrote passionately, their words filled with tenderness. Others were brisk and businesslike, listing qualities like livestock in a ledger. I am strong, honest, and have 80 acres of tillable land. To us it may sound cold, but for them it was practical, an early form of full disclosure. Picture the anticipation of mail day. A farmer rides into town, ties up his horse, and hovers by the post office, his heart thudding as the postmaster shuffles through envelopes. Will there be one with her handwriting? He tucks it into his vest, waits until he's alone, then tears it open, scanning for the words, "Yours truly." Back east, a woman hurries home from the mill, checking the mailbox before even greeting her family, hoping his reply has finally arrived. There's a mainstream fact you'll want to tuck away here. Letter writing was considered an essential social skill in the 19th century, especially for women. Manuals and guides were published teaching the art of proper correspondence. That meant these women often had the advantage. Where men stumbled through their lines, women wrote with practiced polish. The balance of power, at least on paper, leaned their way. And yet the vulnerability was real. Imagine bearing your hopes and flaws to someone you'd never seen, never heard, never touched. Every letter was a gamble, and every silence felt like a heartbreak. Some women waited months for a reply that never came. Some men sent coin after coin for stamps, only to discover the woman had married someone closer to home. But when it worked, oh, it worked. Couples described the peculiar joy of knowing someone through letters alone. "Her words carried me through the winter," one homesteader wrote. Another bride later recalled, "By the time I met him, I already loved him, for I had read his heart." And still, doubts lingered. Was she as kind as her letters claimed? Was he as prosperous as he boasted? The truth remained sealed in envelopes until the day they finally met. Now imagine yourself there, pen in hand, ink blotting on rough paper, choosing each word with care. You fold the letter, lick the seal, and drop it into the post. For weeks it rides in the dark belly of a train, over bridges, through storms, until it lands in someone else's trembling hands. And with that single gesture you are no longer alone. The paper is thin, the handwriting imperfect, but between those lines grows something strong enough to pull strangers across thousands of miles. The letters grew more frequent, the paper softer with wear, and the system itself began to shift under the weight of all that correspondence. At first, words moved slowly, carried by stagecoaches that bounced over rutted trails, or by riders braving swollen rivers and snowy passes. But then, like a miracle of iron and steam, the railroad stretched across the continent, and suddenly the distance between Boston and Boise seemed less like an eternity and more like a few weeks' wait. You can almost hear the shriek of a locomotive whistle cutting across the prairie night. The train barrels past, sparks flying from its smokestack, and inside the mail car clerks shuffle sacks of letters. To them it's routine, but to the miner in Colorado waiting on word from a woman he's never met, it's everything. The expansion of the railroads didn't just move cattle and coal. It carried love, hope, and the fragile possibility of marriage tucked inside plain envelopes. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some men timed their letters according to train schedules, trying to calculate exactly when a reply might return. They'd circle dates on calendars, treating the arrival of the eastbound mail like a holiday. Whole towns would gather when the train stopped, and for a few minutes, the platform became a stage of nervous anticipation. Men in dusty boots pressed forward, while women in city shawls clutched parcels. Every name called by the postmaster carried a jolt of possibility. Historians still argue whether the railroads alone made mail-order brides feasible, or if the hunger for companionship would have forced some other system to develop. Without steel tracks, would love letters still have crossed the plains, just slower, riskier, more likely to vanish in a storm or a bandit raid? It's one of those questions without a neat answer. What we do know is that the railroads transformed the entire culture of communication. Suddenly, towns that once felt like lonely outposts were plugged into a web of ink and newsprint. Newspapers could print more ads, correspondence flowed more freely, and word of marriage by mail spread farther and faster than ever before. Think of the sensory details, the smell of coal smoke clinging to your clothes, the rattle of the train under your feet, the hiss of steam when it halts. You step off at a depot and watch crates unloaded, flour, nails, bolts of fabric. And then, almost carelessly, a clerk tosses down a leather bag crammed with folded envelopes. Ordinary objects, yet inside them, entire futures. There's a mainstream fact worth holding on to here. By the 1870s, the US Postal Service was handling billions of pieces of mail each year, thanks largely to railroad delivery. That meant letters that once took months now arrived in weeks, sometimes even days. For lonely settlers, that speed was intoxicating, but speed had its dangers too. It meant misunderstandings could unfold more rapidly, deceptions travel more quickly, and hopes rise and crash in record time. Imagine sending a letter full of promises only to receive a brisk reply weeks later saying, "I've chosen another." For some, that train carried heartbreak as often as it carried joy. And yet, you can picture the moments of triumph. A rancher in Kansas receiving a letter, scented faintly with lavender, opening it right there on the platform, tears welling as he reads the words, "I will come." Or a woman in New York, clutching an envelope bearing the careful script of the man she hopes to marry, tracing his name with her fingertip. Here's another quirky note. Some letters included tiny sketches, rough drawings of cabins, fences, even pets. One man mailed a crude map showing exactly where his land lay, as if to prove it wasn't a lie. A woman replied with a drawing of her cat, promising she'd bring him along. These weren't professional artists, just lonely people trying to bridge an impossible gap with pencil marks. The railroads didn't erase the risks, of course. Delays still happened, letters still went missing, and sometimes whole sacks of mail were lost to floods or train wrecks. But compared to the days of horseback messengers, the new system felt almost magical. For the first time, love could travel nearly as fast as commerce, stitched together by timetables and iron rails. And as the trains thundered westward, carrying cattle and wheat, they also carried the first organized dreams of a mail-order marriage industry. With every delivery, the idea became less of an experiment and more of a fixture of frontier life. You picture yourself standing by those tracks at dusk, the rails glowing red in the setting sun, waiting for a train that might bring you nothing more than a folded sheet of paper. And yet, that paper could mean everything. You can almost see the idea crystallizing into something more than chance letters and hopeful ads. At first, it was just individuals fumbling through personal columns. But as the railroad stitched the continent tighter and newspapers fanned the flames of curiosity, clever entrepreneurs smelled opportunity. Where there was demand, thousands of lonely men on one side and thousands of unmarried women on the other, there could be a business. And thus the earliest matchmakers of the frontier stepped into the story. Picture a man with slicked hair and a tidy waistcoat, not a miner or rancher, but a newspaperman who has realized he can profit from printing more than cattle prices. He opens a little office, hangs a modest sign, Matrimonial Bureau, and begins cataloguing the names, ages, and brief descriptions of people searching for partners. For a small fee, he'll introduce you by mail, the quirky tidbit. Some of these early agents were anything but romantic. They were practical, sometimes downright mercenary. They treated marriage arrangements like railroad contracts or livestock deals, complete with ledgers and receipts. There are stories of men paying $1 to receive 3 names of eligible women, only to find 2 were already married and the third had never even heard of the Bureau. And yet, even with the scams, demand never waned. Historians still argue whether these entrepreneurs were helping lonely people find love or exploiting their desperation. On one hand, they connected strangers who might never have met otherwise. On the other, they charged fees, embellished descriptions, and sometimes disappeared with the money. One account describes a marriage agent who absconded after collecting hundreds of letters, leaving behind a pile of unopened envelopes that townsfolk later discovered in a rented room. It's hard to decide whether to laugh or wince, but there were reputable agents too. Some bureaus were run by widows or ministers' wives, women who felt they were providing a moral service, bringing stability to rough boom towns and giving single women a chance at a family. A pastor in Nebraska once remarked that male brides were the answer to the whiskey problem, convinced that married men would spend less time at saloons if they had wives at home. Spoiler alert, that theory was optimistic. Think about how the process might have felt. You, a lonely farmer in Dakota Territory, ride half a day to town. You walk into a modest office, hand over your fee, and provide your details. Age, land ownership, habits. The agent scribbles it all down, maybe adds a flattering touch or two. In return, you receive a sheet with 3 women's descriptions. Miss L, 24, teacher, fond of music. Widow R, 32, owns modest dowry, excellent cook. Miss H, 19, adventurous, seeks a man of steady habits. Your pulse quickens as you scan the options, trying to imagine lives you can't yet see. Meanwhile, in the East, women visited similar offices. For a small payment, they could view lists of bachelors, ranchers, miners, merchants, all described with just enough detail to spark interest. Sometimes a photograph was included, stiff and formal, the subject staring grimly into the camera. Women would giggle, swap photos with friends, and debate which man seemed least likely to die in a shootout. Here's the mainstream fact. By the late 19th century, matrimonial bureaus had sprung up in major cities like Chicago and New York. They weren't limited to the West. Urban singles also used them. But on the frontier, they became lifelines, filling the vacuum left by the sheer lack of eligible partners. Of course, you can imagine the awkward moments. A woman receives a letter from a man described as well-established, only to discover he lives in a drafty shack with chickens roosting inside. A man expects a lively young bride and meets a stern schoolteacher who isn't impressed with his muddy boots. Sometimes these mismatches ended quickly, letters ceased, or agreements were cancelled. Other times they led to unions that surprisingly worked. The bureaus themselves became small hubs of gossip. Clerks swapped stories of successful matches, tragic failures, and outright scams. One bureau supposedly placed an ad that read, "Gentleman farmer seeks wife, must appreciate cows." That line got so much attention it turned into a running joke in the local press. As you picture these bustling little agencies, imagine the stacks of envelopes piled high, each one containing a fragment of someone's heart. The matchmakers shuffled them like cards, dealing futures across states and territories. And though not every hand turned out to be a winner, enough did to keep hope alive. From these early entrepreneurs, a pattern began to form. Love, or at least companionship, was no longer just a matter of chance meetings. It was becoming an organized system, a business transaction carried on the rails of commerce and ink. And whether it was cynical exploitation or genuine connection, one thing was certain: the frontier was learning how to manufacture marriage. You drift further along those dusty tracks of history and notice that the mailbags no longer carry only letters between Yankees and Southerners, farmers and schoolteachers. They begin to carry words written in accented English, in broken phrases, in careful penmanship, learned from foreign schools. The story of mail-order brides isn't just about East Coast spinsters meeting lonely ranchers. It's also about immigrants pulled into the system, their lives carried thousands of miles across both oceans and prairies. Imagine the arrival of a ship in San Francisco, the deck crowded with passengers from China, Japan, and the Philippines. Some are laborers bound for railroads and farms, but scattered among them are women, sometimes coming voluntarily, sometimes nudged along by brokers who promised better lives. These women often found themselves caught in the swirl of America's immigration anxieties. Still, their presence reshaped the demographics of Western towns in ways that startled locals. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the late 1800s, some Japanese picture brides exchanged photographs rather than long letters, creating a kind of proto-dating app system. Families arranged the unions, the photos were sent, and the women traveled across the Pacific with little more than a snapshot of the man they would marry. It's as if Tinder had been boiled down to a single sepia portrait in stiff formal wear. Historians still argue whether these immigrant women were victims of a manipulative system or pioneers who seized opportunities unavailable back home. On one hand, many endured prejudice and hardship. On the other, they carved communities out of isolation, keeping cultural traditions alive in alien landscapes. Their marriages often became the foundation of immigrant enclaves, little Japantowns, Chinatowns, and barrios that still exist today. Think of the letters written in halting English: "I come to you, I make home." The words might be few, but the promise was enormous, and the men on the frontier, who themselves may have been immigrants, Irish miners, German farmers, Mexican vaqueros, were sometimes relieved to meet women who understood what it meant to be uprooted. Together they stitched fragments of the old world into the fabric of the new. There's a mainstream fact worth noting here. By the 1870s and 1880s, large waves of European immigrants, particularly from Scandinavia and Germany, moved westward, often as families. But single men came too, and they eagerly joined the mail-order market. Letters in Swedish or German crisscrossed the Atlantic, sometimes taking months to arrive. For these men, an American bride wasn't always possible, but a cousin's cousin back in the old country. That could be arranged with stamps, patience, and luck. Some immigrant women saw marriage to an American man as their ticket into citizenship, property, and security. Others saw it as an escape from rigid traditions back home. Picture a young Polish woman in a crowded tenement in Chicago, answering an ad from a Nebraska farmer who promises wide skies and wheat fields. She dreams of chickens in the yard, a cradle by the stove, and maybe, just maybe, a little independence. Of course, the risks were staggering. Some women arrived only to discover their well-to-do husbands were dirt poor, or worse, already married. Others faced hostility from neighbors who saw them as foreign intruders. Yet despite everything, many endured. They tilled soil, birthed children, and helped build communities where languages blended and new identities were forged. Here's another quirky scene, a Mexican bride arriving in a Texas border town, stepping down from a rattling wagon to find her groom waiting nervously with a bouquet of wildflowers. Locals gossip about whether she'll fit in, but within weeks she's cooking meals that draw half the neighborhood to their table. Her presence softens the rough edges of a place that might otherwise have been just another dusty dot on the map. What emerges here is a picture not just of lonely men finding wives, but of America itself reshaping through these unions. Each immigrant bride carried with her recipes, songs, lullabies, and prayers. They planted gardens with seeds from their homelands, raised children who grew up speaking 2 languages, and insisted on celebrating holidays unfamiliar to their neighbors. Through them, the West became less uniform and more layered, less a blank slate, more a patchwork quilt. As you watch this unfold, you realize the mail-order bride phenomenon was never simply about filling a gap in gender ratios. It was also about knitting together the many strands of migration, desire, and survival. Every letter, every photograph, every arranged meeting carried with it not just the promise of companionship, but the possibility of blending worlds. And so the mailbags grew heavier still, not just with English words, but with the voices of women from across the globe, each one daring to gamble on love in a land that promised both opportunity and peril. Now the train whistles fade into the background, and you find yourself standing on the open prairie. The land rolls out in endless grasses, stretching so wide it almost makes you dizzy. This is the vision many men tried to sell in their letters, the promise of land, of space, of freedom. For women trapped in soot-darkened cities, those words struck like sunlight through a dirty window. Imagine the scene. A woman in Boston wipes coal dust from her window pane, sighs at the sound of factory whistles, and then reads a letter that says, "Out here the sky is so wide it seems heaven itself has stooped low to meet the earth." He describes acres of wheat swaying like golden oceans, or orchards he plans to plant, or simply the peace of a place where neighbors are miles apart. To her, used to cramped boarding houses and the stink of horse-drawn trolleys, it sounds like paradise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some men exaggerated their landholding so wildly that when the women arrived they discovered 40 acres was really 4, and orchards were 2 struggling apple trees. Yet sometimes the women stayed anyway, deciding that even 4 acres was more freedom than a boarding house bunk. Historians still argue whether women were truly lured by these promises of land and opportunity, or if their motivations were more complex: economic necessity, social pressure, or even sheer boredom with city life. Some scholars say the women were practical pioneers, others see them as victims of false advertising. The truth, as usual, likely lies somewhere in between. But to understand their gamble, you have to picture the alternative. Life in eastern cities for single women could be brutal. Jobs were often limited to domestic service, teaching, or factory work. Wages were low and hours long. One misstep, a lost job, an illness, could land a woman in a poorhouse. By contrast, a letter from the frontier promised not just a husband, but a stake in the future, land, food, children, stability. There's a mainstream fact worth noting. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, men, and technically women, though fewer applied, could claim 160 acres of free land if they improved it. That meant that a man could honestly tell a prospective bride, "Come west and this land will be ours." Even if the soil was tough and the winters brutal, the idea of ownership was intoxicating. You can almost feel the weight of those words on the page. I have land. For a woman who had never owned so much as a single room, the promise of shared acres was like gold. Some even wrote back with their own visions. I have dreamed of raising chickens, or I would like a small garden for herbs. Simple desires, but ones denied to them in crowded tenements. Of course, the dream and the reality rarely matched. The prairie wind howled louder than expected, winters froze, wells solid, and summer droughts cracked the soil. Some brides wept at the sight of their new homesteads, sod houses half buried in earth, roofs that leaked, outhouses swarming with flies. And yet even then some clung to the dream of freedom, whispering to themselves that this mud hut was still theirs. Here's another quirky scene. One letter from a Kansas farmer included a hand-drawn sketch of his farmhouse. When the woman arrived, she found it was more of a glorified shack. But she laughed, unpacked her trunk, and declared, "Well, it will be a farmhouse once we add curtains." That single gesture turned a lie into a shared project. The promise of land wasn't just about property, it was about dignity. In the East, women were often reduced to dependents or laborers. On the frontier, they might become partners, co-builders, co-owners. The lines in the soil became lines of hope scratched across the page. So, when you imagine those letters traveling west to east and back again, see them not just as words of affection but as blueprints. They carried dreams of cabins, gardens, barns, and children's laughter echoing across fields. They carried, too, the sound of wind through grass, the sharp crackle of prairie fires, and the deep silence of land that could both cradle and crush. And through it all, one truth lingered. The gamble of leaving behind smoke and crowding for open skies was both terrifying and irresistible. For every woman who stepped off a train into disappointment, another stepped down and breathed in the prairie air, thinking, "This is the life I chose, and it begins here." The dream of land and wide skies had a shine to it, but behind the shimmer lurked shadows, fraud, deceit, and disappointments that stung more sharply than prairie winds. For every honest letter folded and sealed with trembling hope, there was another penned by someone with less noble intentions. Picture this. A man places an ad claiming to be a prosperous farmer with a sturdy homestead and livestock. He describes a warm hearth, fertile fields, and maybe even a small orchard. His letter travels east, and a woman answers, imagining a stable life. But when she arrives, she finds not a sturdy cabin, but a leaky shack, no orchard, and livestock consisting of one half-starved mule. The promise of plenty shrivels into the reality of poverty. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women, savvy to the risks, demanded collateral in their letters, little tokens or family references to prove the man was real. One insisted on a signed affidavit from the local preacher before she agreed to travel. Another asked for a photograph, but later confessed she suspected it had been borrowed from someone else entirely. Early catfishing, frontier style. Historians still argue whether fraud was rampant enough to define the phenomenon, or if these stories were simply the ones most likely to make headlines. For sure, scams existed and people were duped, but many letters were genuine and many unions endured. It's that tension, the fragile line between hope and deception, that gives this chapter of history its peculiar drama. You can almost see the nervous rituals around correspondence. A woman unfolds a letter by lamplight, heart pounding. She wants to believe the words, but she knows she cannot fully trust them. Was his modest farm actually modest, or just wishful thinking? Was his steady nature another way of saying lonely drunk? For men, too, the risks loomed. A photograph could be out of date, a description embellished, or the woman herself uninterested in frontier life once reality hit. The mainstream fact to hold on to here: newspapers sometimes issued public warnings about marriage fraud, reminding readers to be cautious when corresponding with strangers. It was considered enough of a social problem that editors printed columns like "Advice for Matrimonial Correspondence," offering tips on spotting lies. One common warning was to be suspicious of anyone who requested money up front for travel. Many men and women were duped by con artists who vanished as soon as coins changed hands. Some deceptions were petty, others devastating. One man wrote to multiple women at once, proposing marriage to all of them, hoping one would actually arrive. When two showed up on the same train, the scene reportedly ended in chaos and a fistfight on the platform. True or exaggerated, such tales spread like wildfire, fueling skepticism, but also fascination. There's another quirky story that circulated in dime novels. A woman who sent a photograph of her younger sister instead of herself, hoping to secure interest. When the groom-to-be discovered the ruse, he still went through with the marriage, claiming he preferred the older sister's sense of humor. It's the sort of tale that straddles the line between farce and fable. For some, the frauds ended cruelly. A few women traveled hundreds of miles only to be abandoned, stranded without money or family. Others discovered their fiancé had already married someone else. Such tragedies painted the whole practice in suspicion, but they also underscored the desperation driving it. When your choices were limited, even risky promises seemed worth the gamble. Imagine yourself there, stepping off a train, clutching your carpet bag, scanning the crowd for the face you'd only seen in a photograph. Every man looks like he might be yours, and yet none quite match. Finally, someone steps forward, tipping his hat. He's older than he claimed, leaner, maybe missing a tooth. Do you turn away? Or do you force a smile, knowing your entire life just shifted on the strength of letters? Fraud made for juicy stories in the press, but it didn't stop the flow of letters. People kept writing, kept hoping, because loneliness was heavier than caution. And so the cycles spun on: ads, letters, promises, heartbreak, and sometimes real companionship. The system thrived on fragile trust, tested again and again by lies, yet never fully broken. Because in the end, even the risk of deceit was better than the certainty of solitude. The system was already fragile enough with exaggerations and broken promises, but the frontier had one more twist up its sleeve: weddings by proxy. Yes, believe it or not, some couples managed to legally marry without ever setting eyes on one another. The arrangement was both ingenious and slightly absurd, the kind of thing only the Wild West could have normalized. Imagine this: a rancher in Wyoming and a seamstress in Ohio exchange letters for months. They've never met, yet the affection grows. To cut through the delay, they decide to marry on paper before she even boards a train west. All it takes is a lawyer, a witness, and a cooperative judge. In some places, a friend or relative literally stood in place of the absent bride or groom during the ceremony, reciting vows on their behalf. When the woman finally arrived weeks later, she was already Mrs. So-and-so, with the ink long dry on the certificate. Here's a quirky tidbit. One case involved a man who sent his brother to stand in for him during the proxy ceremony because he couldn't leave his cattle. The bride later joked she married the wrong man first, but only for an hour. Technically true, and probably the strangest wedding anecdote to tell at Sunday picnics. Historians still argue whether these proxy marriages were legally sound or merely tolerated by frontier pragmatism. Some courts later overturned them, leaving couples in murky legal territory. Others upheld the unions, reasoning that the vows had been made in good faith, distance notwithstanding. The debate highlights just how elastic the law could become when loneliness and geography collided. The mainstream fact here is that proxy marriages weren't entirely unique to America. They had precedents in Europe, particularly among nobility or military families separated by war. But in the Wild West, they became more common because of sheer necessity. Trains and letters could shorten distance, but not enough to soothe men and women desperate to lock down their futures. You can almost see the strangeness of the moment. A bride in a lace bonnet, standing in a parlour, gazing nervously at a man who is not her husband, but is speaking her vows for her. A preacher raises his Bible, a clerk scribbles notes, and when the ceremony ends, she walks out, married in name only. Later, when she finally meets the real groom, it is less of a wedding than a continuation. The risks were obvious. Some men used proxy marriages as a way to secure women without fully disclosing their circumstances. A woman might step off a train already bound by law to a man she'd never laid eyes on, unable to easily annul the contract. And if the husband turned out cruel, controlling, or unstable, her options were grim. Divorce was rare and costly, and annulments even more so. Yet for all the awkwardness, proxy weddings carried a strange allure. They gave the participants a sense of commitment, a reason to follow through on travel plans, and a badge of seriousness in a world full of scams. For many, it was easier to risk a marriage in absentia than to endure endless uncertainty. Here's another quirky scene. One proxy bride arrived in Kansas and was met at the station by her husband holding a sign with her name scrawled on it. Flustered, she walked past him twice, too embarrassed to admit recognition until he finally called out. "I suppose we're married already," he said sheepishly, and she laughed in relief. That moment, half comic, half tender, captured the peculiar mixture of absurdity and sincerity that defined these unions. It may sound reckless to us now, but remember, this was an era when time itself felt heavier. A woman might spend months traveling west with no guarantee of safety or survival along the way. To arrive unmarried left her vulnerable, legally and socially. To arrive already someone's wife meant a home, protection, and at least a semblance of security. And so, under the prairie sun and the lamplight of frontier towns, proxy marriages stitched together strangers who hadn't yet shared a handshake. Some blossomed into lasting partnerships, others crumbled under the weight of reality. But every one of them testified to how far people would go, how much they would bend laws, customs, and common sense just to escape loneliness. The train screeches to a halt, steam curling into the prairie air, and you step down onto the wooden platform. This is the moment, the first sight of the life you've only known through ink and imagination. Women who had crossed states, oceans, and months of uncertainty found themselves staring into the faces of men who were no longer just words on paper. Some moments were tender, others shocking, and nearly all unforgettable. Imagine being one of those women. Your heart races as you clutch a carpet bag, your best dress already creased from the long journey. The crowd at the depot is mostly men in dust-caked boots and sweat-stained hats. Some hold flowers, wild ones plucked from fields, or store-bought blooms wilted by the heat. Others hold signs scrawled with your name, as if you're both a bride and a package to be claimed. You scan the faces, looking for one that matches the stiff photograph folded in your pocket. Sometimes the first meeting was sweet. One woman wrote in her diary, "He bowed low, removed his hat, and said, 'Welcome home.' I knew then I could love him." Other times it was painfully awkward. A man, expecting a rosy-cheeked young lady, was met by a weary, plain woman who looked older than her letters suggested. She, in turn, might have been expecting a gentleman with a sturdy farm, but found instead a nervous man with dirt under his nails and little to his name. Here's your quirky tidbit. At least one recorded bride burst out laughing upon meeting her groom because he had written in his letters that he was a man of fine stature, only for her to discover he barely reached her shoulder. He laughed too, and they ended up marrying that same week, proving sometimes honesty isn't everything. It's the humour that saves the day. Historians still argue whether these arrivals were more often triumphant or tragic. For every success story preserved in letters and memoirs, there are whispers of heartbreak. Women who stepped off trains, took one look, and promptly bought a return ticket east. The newspapers loved those stories, of course. A runaway bride made far better copy than a happy one, settling into her new life. But many did stay. Think of the sensory flood. The prairie air smells of dust and manure. The sun blazes overhead. The depot boards creak beneath your shoes. Your groom, awkward but earnest, reaches for your bag. Perhaps he offers his arm, stiff with nerves. Perhaps you refuse, testing him. Either way, the two of you walk together toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. In that moment you are strangers, bound by promises scribbled in ink, about to become partners in survival. The mainstream fact to tuck away here is that railroads and stage lines frequently published marriage announcements in local papers, noting the arrival of male brides. Communities followed these arrivals with a mix of fascination and skepticism. For some townsfolk, a new bride meant the town might finally gain a schoolteacher or a midwife. For others, it meant fresh gossip and something to whisper about in the saloon. Of course, disappointment could hit like a sandstorm. Some women fainted upon seeing the harshness of the prairie, muddy streets, crude cabins, and men who looked more worn than romantic. Others, surprisingly, found themselves relieved. The West might have been rough, but at least it was theirs now. Here's another quirky scene. One bride stepped off the train to find her groom holding not flowers but a freshly butchered chicken, insisting it was a practical gift. She later admitted it made her laugh so hard she agreed to marry him on the spot. Practical? Yes. Romantic? Questionable? Memorable? Absolutely. That first step onto the frontier was a leap into the unknown. Women often describe the silence as overwhelming. The hum of insects, the howl of coyotes, the emptiness between towns. Yet in that silence lay possibility. And whether they arrived to sturdy cabins or drafty shacks, whether their grooms were charming or disappointing, they were there now. There was no undoing the journey. And so the story shifted from paper to reality. From neat lines of ink to calloused hands and sunburned faces, from letters that promised comfort to cabins that demanded grit. The mail-order brides had arrived, and the real test of love, endurance, and survival was only beginning. The prairie night settles around you, and for the first time you follow one of these new brides across the threshold of her home. You duck through a low doorway into a cabin made of logs, the gaps stuffed with mud and straw. The air smells of smoke from a wood stove and of damp earth seeping through the floor. This is not the romantic cottage sketched in letters. It's rough, drafty, and about as glamorous as a wooden box tipped on its side. Picture her face, half stunned, half determined, as she sets her trunk down beside a lopsided table. Maybe she remembers the words in his letters. A sturdy house with room for a family. What she sees instead is a single room, one bed, and a stove barely big enough to boil water. A curtain hung on a rope divides bedroom from parlour, and the outhouse squats out back, guarded by flies the size of grapes. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sod houses, common across the plains, were sometimes so leaky that snakes slithered in through the walls. One bride wrote to her sister, "I killed a snake while stirring the stew. He came down the chimney bold as you please." It's funny in retrospect, but at the time it was enough to make anyone wonder if city soot hadn't been preferable. Historians still argue whether these women were prepared for the hardships or deceived by exaggeration. Some claim they knew exactly what they were signing up for: grit, toil, and partnership in survival. Others believe many brides were blindsided, seduced by promises that glossed over just how merciless the prairie could be. The debate endures, and maybe both sides are true, depending on the bride. Think about daily life once the honeymoon glow wore off, if there even was one. Water had to be hauled from a creek or well, laundry beaten against rocks, meals cooked over fire. Winters froze the cabin solid, summers filled it with dust storms and grasshoppers. A woman who'd once worked in a textile mill might find herself kneading bread at dawn, milking cows at noon, and patching trousers by lamplight at night, her hands raw from work. And yet there was pride in endurance. Some brides bragged in letters back home that they could ride a horse better than their husbands within a year, or that they had planted vegetable gardens in soil men had given up on. The cabins may have been crude, but the women's efforts often turned them into something resembling homes. Curtains stitched from flour sacks, wildflowers in chipped mugs, quilts layered against the cold. Each small act a declaration. This may be harsh, but it is ours. The mainstream fact here is that census records and homestead accounts confirm many women made crucial contributions to survival on the frontier. Without them, farms often failed. Men alone could not cook, clean, mend, raise children, and tend crops at the same time. Wives weren't luxuries, they were the difference between success and collapse, and sometimes expectations collided hilariously. A groom, proud of his log cabin, might puff out his chest as he opened the door, only to hear his bride mutter, "This isn't a house, it's a crate." Another might try to impress her with a stew cooked from beans and bacon, which she promptly declared inedible, vowing to take over the cooking at once. These moments of friction weren't just funny, they were the beginning of marriages forged not by letters, but by the daily grind of reality. Imagine her first night in that drafty cabin. The wind howls through the cracks, rattling the shutters. She lies awake, staring at the low ceiling, wondering if she has made a terrible mistake. But then she turns and sees him beside her, awkward, uncertain, but steady. Maybe he squeezes her hand, maybe he just snores. Either way, she realizes that survival will depend not on the house itself, but on what they can build together. And so, the cabin, mud-chinked, smoky, snake-infested though it might be, becomes the crucible where letters turn into lived lives. The paper dreams wrinkle and fray, but something sturdier begins to grow in their place. The stubborn will to endure side by side. The prairie winds howl outside the cabin, but inside another storm brews, the challenge of weaving two different worlds together. The West was never a monoculture. It was a patchwork of immigrant groups, native-born settlers, and indigenous peoples. Into that mix arrived mail-order brides, bringing with them languages, customs, and habits that often collided with their new communities. Imagine a German bride stepping into a Kansas homestead, unpacking not just her dresses but jars of sauerkraut she brought on the train. Her husband, raised on beans and salt pork, wrinkles his nose but eventually comes to love the tang. Or picture a Swedish bride humming folk songs as she kneads bread, filling a lonely prairie night with melodies no one else in the county understands. These women didn't just adapt, they transformed the cultural flavor of their towns, one recipe, one lullaby, one Sunday tradition at a time. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Scandinavian brides brought along seed packets from their homeland. They planted rye, dill, and cabbage in frontier soil, creating gardens that baffled their neighbors but comforted them with tastes of home. One neighbor complained in a letter that the Swedes will eat nothing but their sour bread and soups, yet within a generation those foods became part of the regional diet. Historians still argue whether these cultural blends smoothed tensions or sharpened them. Did intermarriage create harmony, or did it highlight divisions? In some places, immigrant brides were celebrated for civilizing their husbands. In others, they faced suspicion, whispers of being foreign or not quite American. The scholarly debate lingers. Were these women accepted as pioneers or tolerated as outsiders? The mainstream fact stands. Census records from the late 19th century show high rates of intermarriage among immigrant groups in frontier communities. German women often married Irish men, Scandinavian brides wed Yankee farmers. These unions produced children who spoke a jumble of English, German, and Swedish, living proof of a new American identity taking root. But it wasn't just Europeans. Asian and Mexican brides also played a role, though their experiences were far harsher. Anti-immigrant sentiment often turned their marriages into targets of prejudice. A Chinese bride might face laws that restricted her citizenship, or a Mexican bride might be dismissed by Anglo neighbors as unfit. Yet despite the hostility, these women raised families, opened shops, and left indelible marks on their towns. Picture a small frontier church on a Sunday morning. The congregation is a curious blend, women in bonnets, men in worn coats, children squirming on pews. Among them sits a Polish bride, whispering prayers in her own tongue, while beside her a Yankee farmer mouths hymns in English. After the service they share a potluck, pickled herring next to cornbread, tamales beside apple pie. The table itself becomes a symbol of what the West was becoming, a patchwork meal for a patchwork people. And of course, not all blends were smooth. Some women clung fiercely to their old traditions, causing friction with husbands who expected them to be American. Others embraced the new, so eagerly they forgot their old songs and stories. The balance was delicate, and each marriage struck it differently. Here's another quirky scene. A bride from Ireland insisted on celebrating St. Patrick's Day in a Wyoming mining camp. At first, the miners mocked her shamrocks and insisted whiskey was celebration enough. But she cooked a feast, sang songs late into the night, and by morning the camp had declared St. Patrick's Day a new annual tradition. Sometimes one stubborn woman could shift the habits of a whole town. As you sit with this, you realize that these brides were more than companions. They were culture bearers. They stitched fragments of the old world into the raw cloth of the new, and the result was something both strange and beautiful. They made the West not just a place of survival, but of identity, woven from letters, gardens, lullabies, and stubborn acts of belonging. You push open the cabin door one chilly morning, and the prairie stretches out, quiet except for the crows circling above. But inside the settlement, there's a noise less natural. Whispers, mutters, side-eyes. Not everyone welcomed the mail-order brides with open arms. Some of the sharpest critics were local women already living in these towns who suddenly saw strangers stepping into what they felt were their rightful places. Imagine a widow who had managed a boarding house in a rough boom town. She'd held her own, providing meals and laundry services, and had her pick of suitors among the lonely miners. Suddenly, trains unload a half-dozen fresh-faced women from back east, and overnight the balance shifts. Her business still survives, but her influence in town begins to fade. Or picture a schoolteacher who has been wooed by every eligible bachelor within 50 miles until new brides arrive, bringing novelty and competition she hadn't bargained for. Here's your quirky tidbit. There are stories of frontier dances where local women deliberately wore their finest dresses to outshine the male brides, hoping to prove that real Western women were more resilient and desirable than the newcomers. One report mentions a Kansas dance where insults flew faster than fiddle tunes, petticoats compared, hairstyles mocked, even whispered jabs about who had real calluses from frontier life. Historians still argue whether this tension was widespread or just the stuff of gossip columns. Some scholars argue that most frontier communities eagerly welcomed any women who arrived, seeing them as relief in a sea of men. Others believe jealousy and rivalry brewed under the surface, especially in towns where eligible women had long held social power. The truth, as usual, probably depends on the size of the town and the scarcity of single men. The mainstream fact here, frontier newspapers often reported on the arrival of mail-order brides with a mix of admiration and mockery. Headlines might announce, 3 new ladies arrive in Cheyenne. Hearts will break tonight, treating the event as both social news and entertainment. To the local women reading those lines, it may have felt less like charming news and more like an intrusion. Imagine the awkward silences at church suppers. A male bride sits down with her new husband, and the other women glance sideways, whispering about whether she'll last the winter. They measure her by how quickly she learns to churn butter, sew quilts, or haul water without complaint. One slip, burned bread, torn dress, or a sniffle during a dust storm, and she risks being labelled too soft for the West. And yet, over time, many of these tensions softened. Rivalries turned into alliances when survival demanded it. A local woman might scoff at the city bride one day, but show her how to salt meat for winter the next. And the brides in turn brought new skills, better literacy, polished manners, even knowledge of new recipes or medicines. Slowly, a rough balance formed, though not without friction. Here's another quirky scene. In one Wyoming town, 2 brides arrived on the same train, both promised to the same man. When the mix-up came to light, the other women of the settlement sided with the brides, shunning the man until he fled town. The brides ended up marrying different suitors, but the solidarity of the women became a local legend. What you sense in all this is how fragile social dynamics were on the frontier. A handful of new arrivals could tilt the balance between friendliness and rivalry, between suspicion and acceptance. For every town that embraced its new brides, there was another where local women muttered that outsiders were upsetting the order. But whether welcomed or resented, the mail-order brides changed things. They shifted the roles available to women, disrupted monopolies on attention, and forced towns to renegotiate what it meant to belong. And in the end, belonging was as much about grit as it was about birthright. The women who endured earned their place, whether neighbors liked it or not. The prairie wind keeps blowing, rattling shutters and stirring up dust, but inside, small courthouses and makeshift offices, another storm brews, the law trying to catch up with the peculiar reality of mail-order marriages. For as much as the West thrived on improvisation, the question of what counted as a legal marriage wasn't always so simple. Imagine a young bride arriving in Dakota Territory with a marriage certificate from a proxy ceremony held back east. The local clerk squints at the paper, scratches his head, and wonders aloud whether it's valid here. The preacher insists it is. The sheriff mutters that it isn't. And until someone higher up decides, the couple lives in an uneasy limbo, married in theory, uncertain in practice. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some brides arrived to discover that the man they had married by proxy had already died. One case in Nebraska involved a woman who technically arrived as a widow before she'd even met her husband. The town, confused, still hosted a funeral in her honor, serving her casseroles as though she were family. Historians still argue whether frontier courts were deliberately lax, willing to look the other way in order to stabilize communities, or whether the chaos simply outpaced the law. Records suggest both. In some counties, marriages by letter or proxy were quietly accepted. In others, they were challenged, sometimes annulled, leaving women in precarious positions. The grey zone of legality made these unions both fragile and oddly resilient. The mainstream fact to remember: by the late 19th century, marriage laws were still governed largely by individual states and territories, and recognition varied wildly. Some required in-person vows, while others allowed consent by proxy. The patchwork system meant a couple could be considered married in one jurisdiction and not in another, awkward to say the least, when property, inheritance, or children came into question. Picture the courtroom scenes. A woman sits nervously on a wooden bench, clutching a letter as evidence that vows were exchanged. A judge leans back, unimpressed, while the husband swears he mailed consent. Lawyers debate the meaning of present. Meanwhile, the entire town gossips outside, waiting to see if the bride will be declared a lawful wife or a mere stranger with a trunk full of dresses. Of course, legal questions weren't the only complications. Immigration laws added another layer of confusion. Asian brides, for example, often faced restrictions under exclusionary policies, which cast suspicion on their unions even if technically valid. Mexican brides along the border sometimes found their marriages recognized 1 mile south, but disputed 1 mile north. Here's another quirky scene. One judge in Colorado, exasperated by constant disputes, reportedly declared, "If she lives in your house, cooks your meals, and yells at you like a wife, she is a wife." Case closed. Crude, yes, but perhaps the most frontier ruling you'll ever hear. The complications didn't end there. Divorce was another tangle. A woman who regretted her choice after arriving might discover that dissolving the marriage required travel back east, money she didn't have, or months of court wrangling. Some simply walked away, vanishing into another settlement and remarrying without paperwork, hoping nobody cared enough to challenge them. All of this left the frontier buzzing with uncertainty. Was the male bride legally protected? Was her property secure? Would her children be considered legitimate? Each case depended on time, place, and the whims of the local authorities. And yet, despite the chaos, life went on. Couples tilled fields, raised families, and built homes as though the law had blessed them, whether it truly had or not. The legal greyness was both a curse and a freedom, troublesome when things went wrong, but liberating in a land where paperwork always lagged behind survival. So, in the dim lamplight of those frontier nights, couples lay side by side, their marriage certificates folded in trunks, their status debated by lawyers, but their bond tested instead by cold winters, droughts, and the sheer grit it took to endure. The dust swirls on a hot afternoon, and you wander into a boomtown that looks more like chaos, stitched together by wooden planks. Men bellow at each other over poker games, whiskey flows, and the sheriff's jailhouse is already full before sundown. Into this scene step the mail-order brides, women who, quite unintentionally, begin to tilt the balance of power and politics in ways few expected. Picture a bride, newly arrived, her dress wrinkled from weeks of travel. She looks around at streets littered with bottles, men slumped against walls, and saloons louder than the church on Sunday. Within weeks, she's lobbying her husband and neighbors to do something about it. And suddenly a voice that wasn't there before begins to shape the civic life of the town. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one Montana settlement, newly arrived brides reportedly staged an impromptu protest against the saloon district. They marched with pots and pans, banging them until the bartender closed early. It wasn't an official ordinance, but the noise was enough to buy them one quiet night. Historians still argue whether women truly held sway in these towns or whether their influence has been romanticized in hindsight. On one hand, evidence shows women spearheaded causes like temperance, schools, and libraries. On the other, some historians argue that the rough-and-tumble world of frontier politics remained firmly in men's hands, with women limited to persuasion in the home. The truth likely is somewhere in between, quiet but undeniable influence. The mainstream fact here is that by the late 19th century, many frontier states and territories granted women voting rights earlier than those back east. Wyoming did so in 1869, followed by Utah in 1870. The arrival of women, including mail-order brides, was part of the reason. Leaders hoped suffrage would attract more women to settle, stabilizing the male-heavy populations. In other words, politics itself bent to accommodate the presence of women. Think of the ripple effect. A bride starts a Sunday school, drawing children away from saloons and gambling dens. Another insists her husband fence in his livestock, tidying up a street littered with wandering cattle. Another petitions for a schoolhouse, convincing the town to raise funds by selling plots of land. Each act is small but combined. They transform the settlement from a rough camp into a town with order. And of course, it wasn't all civic-minded nobility. Some women wielded influence in quieter, more personal ways. A sharp-tongued wife could sway her husband's vote at a town meeting or convince him to back a particular sheriff. Behind closed doors, many decisions bore the fingerprints of women who never set foot on the official stage. Here's another quirky scene. In Colorado, one male bride famously refused to cook for her husband until he signed a petition to limit liquor licenses. He grumbled but eventually caved, and so did several of his friends whose wives had the same idea. It wasn't democracy in the traditional sense, but it was effective frontier politics nonetheless. Over time, towns that welcomed mail-order brides often gained reputations as civilized compared to those that didn't. Schools sprouted faster, churches filled pews, and crime rates dipped as men were forced, by wives, if nothing else, to spend fewer nights in the saloon. The transformation wasn't overnight, but it was steady, and it reshaped the image of the West from lawless wilderness to budding society. Imagine a town meeting at dusk. The room smells of kerosene and sweat. Men argue loudly about taxes and land rights. But in the corner, women sit quietly, sewing or rocking children, their presence a reminder that the decisions made here now affect families, not just bachelors. The arguments soften, the tone shifts, a saloon license gets denied, a fund for a new school approved. And just like that, the male brides become invisible architects of frontier politics. In the end, they weren't just wives, they were stabilizers, reformers, and sometimes reluctant revolutionaries. By stepping into dusty towns and demanding more than whiskey and poker, they changed the very heartbeat of the frontier. You slip into the wooden pew of a small frontier church, the air heavy with the scent of pine boards and kerosene lamps. On the frontier, religion was more than ritual. It was a glue, a measure of respectability, and often a matchmaking service all its own. Mail-order brides didn't arrive into a vacuum. They were quickly folded into networks of pastors, missionaries, and churchwomen, eager to ensure these marriages carried a moral stamp. Imagine a Sunday morning in a prairie town. The men sit stiffly in clean shirts, hair slicked back for once, while the new brides arrive in bonnets and modest dresses. Everyone watches, whispering about who married whom, and whether she seems a good Christian woman. The pressure was enormous. For many brides, attending church wasn't optional. It was the surest way to be accepted. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some ministers actually ran matrimonial clubs out of their churches, pairing bachelors with brides-to-be in correspondence that they supervised. The idea was that if the church acted as a middleman, the unions would be more moral and less prone to scandal. One minister even offered to proofread men's letters, striking out any phrases he deemed too forward. Imagine your love letter edited into a sermon. Historians still argue whether religious groups genuinely empowered women in this system or simply controlled them more tightly. On one hand, pastors and missionary societies gave women a degree of protection, ensuring they weren't thrown into marriages with known drunkards or scoundrels. On the other, the church sometimes turned a blind eye to abusive men if they were faithful members. The tension lingers. Were male brides safeguarded or further bound by religious oversight? The mainstream fact to hold here, many Protestant missionary societies in the late 1800s explicitly promoted civilizing the frontier by sending women westward. They believed female presence would tame wild men and establish moral order. Catholic parishes did similar work, bringing nuns and brides to support new immigrant communities. Marriage was not just personal, it was seen as divine work. Think about the ceremonies themselves. Weddings on the frontier could be surprisingly elaborate. For places with dirt streets and sod houses, brides wore white if they could, or simply their best dress. Grooms often borrowed suits. Ministers delivered fiery sermons about God's plan for families, while fiddlers struck up tunes for dances that sometimes lasted until dawn. The church's blessing wasn't just ritual, it was insurance against whispers of immorality, and yet there were plenty of contradictions. Some ministers who preached purity by day quietly officiated marriages for couples who had barely met by night. Others frowned on proxy marriages but blessed them anyway, reasoning that better wed on paper than live in sin. Pragmatism often trumped doctrine once you were 2 days' ride from the nearest bishop. Here's another quirky scene. A preacher in Texas reportedly married a couple in the back of a saloon because it was the only building large enough to hold the guests. He insisted on draping a white sheet over the poker table to make it holy ground. Whether that satisfied heaven or not, the couple seemed content. The presence of brides also deepened community ties. Once married, women often led Sunday schools, organized hymn sings, and stitched quilts for new churches. They weren't just attendees, they became the lifeblood of religious life. Their songs filled wooden chapels, their casseroles fed after-service gatherings, and their insistence on order helped keep men from slipping back into lawless habits. And still, for all the good intentions, some brides found the religious oversight suffocating. They had hoped for freedom on the frontier, only to be bound by stricter expectations. A woman who didn't attend church might be branded loose, even if she simply preferred a quiet Sunday at home. For some, the West was less wild than they'd imagined, and more tightly woven into the moral net of small-town judgment. So as you sit in that pew, listening to the preacher thunder about the sanctity of marriage, you notice the sideways glances, the whispered judgments, and the hopeful smiles. Religion gave legitimacy to mail-order unions, but it also layered them with expectations of morality, obedience, and appearances. And in that mix of hymns and gossip, the story of these brides took on yet another shade. The church bells fade and you find yourself back on the main street of town, where gossip moves quicker than the prairie wind. For every quiet wedding or tender reunion, there was a scandal waiting to be told. Mail-order brides were irresistible fodder for newspapers hungry for drama, and frontier gossip circles thrived on stories that blurred the line between truth and exaggeration. Picture a headline in bold letters: "Bride flees groom within hours of arrival." The article would describe in salacious detail how a woman stepped off the train, took one look at her intended, and bolted. Whether it actually happened that way hardly mattered. Such stories sold papers and gave townsfolk endless fuel for whispers over coffee and whiskey. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Nebraska paper reported a case where a bride disappeared on her wedding night, only to be found weeks later living in a nearby boarding house and working as a seamstress. When asked why she left, she quipped, "His cabin had more holes than his promises." That line became a local punchline repeated for years at dances and saloons. Historians still argue whether the press exaggerated these scandals for entertainment or whether the West truly produced a steady stream of dramatic failures. What is certain is that editors leaned into the spectacle. A runaway bride was news. A contented couple planting potatoes? That was boring. And so the public image of mail-order marriages often skewed toward the outrageous. The mainstream fact here, by the late 1800s, dime novels and sensational newspapers had become hugely popular, and stories of runaway or duped brides fit perfectly into the genre. Sometimes the tales carried moral warnings. Don't trust strangers with your heart. Other times, they were just meant to make readers chuckle at the foolishness of frontier love. Some scandals were tragic rather than comic. There were reports of grooms who turned violent, brides who vanished under mysterious circumstances, and marriages that ended in lawsuits over fraud. One case in Colorado saw a bride suing her groom for misrepresentation. He had claimed to own land when he was in fact a hired hand. The court sided with her, making it one of the earliest false advertising cases in matrimonial history. And then there were the truly bizarre tales. One paper gleefully printed a story of a bride who arrived to find her groom already married to another woman. Instead of fleeing, she married his brother 2 days later. True? Hard to say. Entertaining? Absolutely. Imagine the ripple of gossip in a small town. A bride faints at the altar, whispers erupt. Another refuses to cook her first supper, and the neighbors buzz for weeks. Scandals didn't need to be monumental. They only needed to be repeated, and repeated they were, with each retelling polishing the details until ordinary disappointments became legends. Here's another quirky scene. In one Kansas settlement, a bride was rumored to have shot at her husband on the second night. In reality, she'd fired a pistol at a raccoon raiding the chicken coop. But by the time the tale reached the next town over, she was a wild-eyed woman who nearly killed her groom. The myth stuck, and she lived under that shadow for years. For the brides themselves, these scandals could be devastating. A single rumor could brand a woman as untrustworthy, flighty, or worse, even if she had done nothing wrong. Men, too, suffered reputational damage. No one wanted to be known as the fellow whose bride ran off. And yet, despite the risk of gossip, the system endured. Loneliness outweighed fear of humiliation. So as you walk down that street, you hear it all. Laughter at tall tales, mutters about real heartbreak, and the clatter of newspapers hitting porches with yet another headline about a runaway bride. In the end, scandal didn't just color the story of mail-order brides, it became part of the fabric, the noisy backdrop against which real lives unfolded. You leave behind the gossip-slicked main street and wander into a quieter lane, where lamplight spills from a cabin window. Inside, you see a couple sitting close, reading a letter aloud to one another. Not every story was tragic, scandalous, or riddled with disappointment. Against the odds, many of these paper-born unions blossomed into real, enduring love. Imagine a miner, hardened by years underground, who once wrote stiff, clumsy sentences to a woman in Ohio. She replied with patient warmth, teasing him gently about his spelling, and he wrote back with humor, promising to learn. Months later, when she stepped off the train, he stammered through his vows, but the affection in his eyes spoke louder than words. Years afterward, she recalled that she had never doubted her choice. Not once. Here's your quirky tidbit. One bride later admitted that she fell in love with her husband before meeting him because he had enclosed a sketch of his cat in one letter. "Any man who drew whiskers crooked with such care," she wrote, "must have a tender heart." They remained married for 50 years. Who knew bad cat art could seal a lifelong romance? Historians still argue whether these success stories were more common than the disasters, or whether they simply received less attention because happiness makes dull headlines. Surviving letters and diaries suggest a surprising number of couples did, in fact, find comfort and even passion in one another. The gamble, risky as it was, sometimes paid off. The mainstream fact is that many mail-order marriages endured long enough to raise families, establish farms, and stabilize communities. Census records show households with multiple children, homesteads that prospered, and marriages that lasted decades. These aren't the tales that filled newspapers, but they are the ones that quietly shaped the backbone of the West. Picture their evenings together. A bride reads by lamplight while her husband whittles by the fire. They share stories of childhood spent in different worlds, hers in a noisy eastern boarding house, his on the wide prairie. Slowly, those worlds merge into one. Their laughter fills the cabin, and for the first time, the loneliness that drove them to letters feels like a distant ghost. Not all success stories were grand. Some were modest, almost invisible. A bride and groom planting their first garden together, proud when the beans sprout. A couple dancing in the kitchen to the tune of a fiddle, their steps clumsy, but their smiles wide. A woman writing home to her sister, "I am happy, he is kind." No headline, no scandal, just the ordinary miracle of two people making a life together. Here's another quirky scene. One husband reportedly built a small porch on his cabin just so his wife could sit outside and drink tea like she did back east. Neighbors teased him for being henpecked, but he didn't care. The porch became her favorite place, and he admitted later that he liked it too. Sometimes love was nothing more than listening to small requests and saying yes. Of course, the West was still harsh. Love didn't keep the blizzards away or the crops alive. But having someone to share the hardship with, someone to laugh when the bread burned, someone to hold during storms, made the difference between despair and endurance. As you sit outside that cabin in your imagination, the night sky sprawled with stars, you realize that for some mail-order brides, the gamble was worth it. Their letters became lives, their hopes became families, and their stories, though quieter than the scandals, are the ones that truly shaped the heartbeat of the frontier. The lamplight flickers low and you step into another cabin. This one, quieter, its silence heavy. Not all stories ended with laughter and porches built out of love. Some ended with tears, anger, or the kind of loneliness that hurts more when you aren't alone. For every couple that found happiness, others discovered disappointment, cruelty, or despair. Imagine a woman stepping off the train to meet her husband, only to find him not just older than his letters suggested, but also harsh, impatient, even violent. She has nowhere else to go. Returning east would mean shame and poverty. Staying means enduring a marriage that feels like a trap. Many did stay, gritting their teeth through years of hardship. Here's your quirky tidbit. One bride wrote home that her husband kept pigs in the house during winter, and when I complained, he told me to keep quieter than the pigs. The letter circulated among her family back east as both a warning and a grim joke. Needless to say, she did not encourage her sisters to follow her path. Historians still argue whether the darker side of mail-order marriages was the exception or the rule. Some claim most unions muddled along reasonably well, with only a few disasters. Others insist that the power imbalance, men choosing, women travelling, set the stage for frequent abuse. The truth is likely somewhere in the grey middle, written in countless diaries we'll never read. The mainstream fact is that frontier divorce, while rare, did exist. Records show women petitioning for separation on grounds of abandonment, cruelty, or drunkenness. But divorce required money, legal access, and public exposure, not things many isolated women could muster. Most had little choice but to endure. Think of the isolation. A woman, miles from her nearest neighbour, listens to her husband's boots thudding across the floorboards, dreading what comes next. Or picture her tending children alone while he spends nights at the saloon. For some, the letters that once promised hope became bitter reminders of broken promises. Sometimes the despair turned quiet. Women withdrew into themselves, speaking less, writing home less often, until they became ghostly presences in their own lives. Other times, the despair turned loud. Arguments spilled into the street, neighbours heard shouts, and occasionally fists flew. Scandals made headlines not just for runaway brides, but for violent clashes that left whole communities uneasy. Here's another quirky scene. In one Montana town, a bride famously threw her husband's boots into the fire after he staggered home, drunk, for the 10th night in a row. He fished them out too late and spent the winter with charred leather wrapped in rags. Locals retold the story with laughter, but underneath it was the raw truth of her frustration. The children of these unions often carried the heaviest burdens. Some grew up in homes full of tension, their parents' letters of courtship tucked away in trunks like cruel jokes. Others were abandoned altogether, fathers disappearing into mining camps, mothers fleeing back east. These stories remind you that not all gambles pay off, and not all ink promises survive the test of reality. And yet even in the failures you see the resilience. Some women, against all odds, carved out lives on their own after leaving cruel husbands. They took in laundry, worked as midwives, or ran boarding houses. Others leaned on networks of fellow brides who understood their struggles and offered quiet solidarity. So as you sit with these stories, you realize the mail-order bride phenomenon wasn't a fairy tale. It was a gamble with stakes as high as the wide sky itself. For some it brought joy, for others heartbreak, and for many it brought a messy mix of both. The fire in the cabin pops, and outside the wind sweeps across the prairie, carrying with it more than dust. It carries stories, reshaped and exaggerated until they no longer belong to the people who lived them. For as long as there were mail-order brides, there were also tall tales, dime novels, and local legends turning real women into characters of folklore. Imagine sitting in a saloon as a moustached storyteller leans back in his chair, puffing on a pipe. He tells of the bride who shot 3 coyotes on her wedding night, or the one who tamed her husband with a frying pan before breakfast. The men roar with laughter, the story grows taller with each telling, and before long, nobody remembers what really happened. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some dime novels of the 1880s featured mail-order brides as heroines in sensational plots. One pulp described a bride who turned out to be an heiress in disguise. Another painted her as a spy fleeing the law. These paperbacks sold for pennies and were devoured by readers who loved the drama, even if it bore little resemblance to the drudgery of hauling water or patching clothes. Historians still argue whether these portrayals helped normalize the idea of male brides or mocked them into caricatures. Did they give women a mythic aura of toughness, or did they trivialize their hardships? Either way, the fiction stuck. Even today, people imagine the Wild West bride as some larger-than-life figure rather than a tired young woman scrubbing floors in a drafty cabin. The mainstream fact: dime novels were one of the most popular forms of literature in 19th century America, with hundreds of titles printed and sold across the country. They helped cement the myth of the Wild West, cowboys, outlaws, and, yes, adventurous brides, into the American imagination. But folklore didn't just come from novels, it grew out of whispers and exaggerations. A bride who walked 2 miles through snow to fetch water became, in retellings, a woman who fought wolves along the way. A woman who scolded her husband at a barn dance became the bride who beat him in public. These tales, told over and over, built a mythology that outpaced reality. Here's another quirky scene. In one Colorado town, children played a game called Runaway Bride, where one child pretended to step off a train and then bolted while the others chased. It was half tag, half theatre, all borrowed from the gossip adults swapped in hushed tones. Even kids absorbed the folklore, reshaping it into play. Folklore also created reputations that stuck unfairly. A woman who left her husband quietly might later be remembered as the wild bride who couldn't be tamed. A bride who endured faithfully might be turned into a legend of impossible saintliness. In both cases, the real human, her doubts, her strength, her flaws, was erased by the story others preferred to tell. You can almost hear the fiddle at a frontier dance, the laughter rising as someone retells the tale of the bride who demanded a piano before agreeing to wed. Maybe she only asked for a stool, but a piano makes a better punchline. In a world starved for entertainment, brides became unwilling celebrities, their lives dramatized for audiences hungry for amusement. And yet, in these exaggerations, you catch glimpses of truth. The stories, though distorted, acknowledged the grit it took to survive as a woman on the frontier. They honored, in roundabout ways, the courage of stepping off a train into the unknown. Even when the tales turned comic, they carried respect for women who dared to risk everything for a chance at life on the edge of civilization. So as you lean back in that saloon chair, listening to yarns spun taller than windmill blades, you realize folklore blurred the line between history and myth. The mail-order bride became both a real woman with calloused hands and a legendary figure who tamed outlaws and fought off wolves with nothing but a broom. Somewhere between the gossip and the dime novels lies the truth, a truth both quieter and braver than the myths admit. The fire in the saloon crackles low, and you step outside again into the chill prairie night. Behind the legends and gossip lies a far plainer truth. Economics had as much to do with mail-order marriages as romance ever did. Love letters may have stirred hearts, but it was the hard numbers of farming, mining, and cattle drives that truly drove demand. Imagine a gold rush town in its heyday. Streets swarm with men panning in streams by day and gambling by night. They strike it rich one week and are broke the next. Without women, the settlement is little more than a glorified camp. But add brides, and suddenly families form, schools are built, and a church rises from the dust. Investors take notice, merchants move in, and the town stabilizes. A wife wasn't just a partner, she was economic infrastructure. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Colorado mining company reportedly sponsored advertisements for brides in eastern newspapers, believing that married miners would drink less and work harder. Whether that theory actually worked is debatable, but the company insisted productivity rose whenever wives arrived. Who knew matrimony could be considered part of a business plan? Historians still argue whether these women were primarily viewed as economic assets or respected as equal partners. Some scholars claim men sought wives largely to stabilize property and labor, while others argue that affection and companionship mattered just as much. Both views hold some truth. The need for survival blurred the line between love and practicality. The mainstream fact here, under the Homestead Act of 1862, any adult could claim 160 acres of free land, provided they improved it. While single women could file claims, the majority of successful homesteads were managed by married couples. That reality made brides essential for survival, another set of hands to till fields, tend animals, and bear children, who could help as they grew. Think of the rhythm of a farm couple's life. At dawn, he harnesses the mule while she tends the garden. By midday, they're both in the fields, sweat pouring as they plant or harvest. At night, she mends clothes by lamplight while he sharpens tools. Every task has its complement. Without her, half the labor would collapse. Without him, the land might go fallow. Marriage wasn't just companionship. It was the backbone of economic survival. But economics wasn't only about survival, it was also about aspiration. Men dreamed of building wealth through cattle or crops, and women dreamed of upward mobility beyond city slums. For many brides, the chance to own a piece of land through marriage, even indirectly, was more than romance. It was a kind of emancipation. To go from sewing shirts for pennies to co-owning a farm, however modest, was a leap in status and security. Here's another quirky scene. In one Kansas town, a bride refused to marry her suitor until he built her a proper chicken coop. He obliged, and she later joked that my dowry was 12 hens and the promise of eggs. Practical, yes, but also revealing. Marriage negotiations often blended affection with hard-headed economics. Cattle drives added another layer. Cowboys lived transient lives, chasing herds across states. Many dreamed of settling down, but knew they needed wives to anchor them to one place. For women, marrying a cowboy might mean trading city wages for the uncertainty of open range, but it also meant stepping into a role where their labor directly contributed to building ranches that lasted generations. And then there was money, cold, hard cash. Matrimonial agencies charged fees. Train companies profited from transporting brides. Even photographers made a killing selling portraits used in correspondence. The entire mail-order system became an industry, feeding off the economics of desire and loneliness. So as you walk back across that quiet town, you see it more clearly. Every letter wasn't just a plea for affection. It was a transaction, a blueprint for survival, a ledger scratched out in ink. The West wasn't just built on pickaxes and cattle brands. It was also built on marriages that doubled as partnerships in labor, finance, and ambition. And in that mix of love and ledger books, the story of the mail-order bride grew not just sentimental, but deeply, stubbornly practical. The prairie sun rises over a settlement that seems, for once, almost calm. Chickens scatter in the yard, smoke curls from chimneys, and the sound of children's laughter drifts from behind a cabin. If the West was once the domain of restless men, the arrival of mail-order brides shifted it into something sturdier. Beyond cooking and cleaning, these women became builders, not just of homes, but of entire communities. Imagine a bride unpacking her trunk on her first morning, pulling out not only dresses but also school books. In many towns, the first teachers were male brides who had once worked in Eastern classrooms. Within weeks, a log schoolhouse rose, furnished with rough benches and slate boards. A town that yesterday had only whiskey halls and card tables suddenly had lessons recited in sing-song voices. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one frontier town, a bride reportedly taught children to read using pages from the Sears catalogue because proper books were scarce. The children not only learned their letters but also memorized the prices of corsets and plows, literacy and consumer education, all in one. Historians still argue whether these women were welcomed as equal partners in building towns or whether their contributions were minimized at the time. Diaries reveal both, women proud of founding schools and shops and men boasting they alone tamed the frontier. The debate continues. Were they invisible laborers or quiet architects? The mainstream fact here, census and settlement records, show that once women arrived, communities rapidly added institutions like schools, churches, and even local newspapers. The presence of families signaled permanence. Investors were more likely to fund rail lines, merchants more willing to open shops. brides were, quite literally, proof that towns were here to stay. Picture a male bride standing behind the counter of a small general store she and her husband built together. She weighs flour, tallies accounts, and greets neighbors who once gawked at her arrival. Another bride stitches dresses for the entire settlement, her sewing machine clattering late into the night. A third organizes quilting circles, which become more than stitching bees. They're social hubs where women share advice, recipes, and quiet solidarity. These women were more than homemakers. They were healers, midwives, and teachers. One might keep herbs in jars for treating fevers, another might lend out novels for neighbors hungry for stories. In small, practical ways, they pulled towns away from lawless camps and towards something resembling stability. Here's another quirky scene. A male bride in Texas started a small bakery out of her cabin, baking bread twice a week. Her loaves became so popular that cowboys rode miles just to buy them. Eventually, her cabin became the town's first bakery, and she its first business owner. What began as survival turned into enterprise. And it wasn't just the visible institutions. These brides created culture, organizing dances, insisting on holiday celebrations, planting flower gardens beside cabins. For settlers used to saloon brawls and dust storms, the sight of roses climbing a fence or the sound of a piano carried on the wind was nothing short of miraculous. The irony, of course, is that many women never intended to become community leaders. They came west for marriage, for land, for survival. Yet, in filling gaps, teaching, healing, organizing, they reshaped the very identity of the frontier. Towns became less about men gambling in smoke-filled saloons and more about families gathering for Sunday suppers. So, as you walk through this growing settlement, you notice the subtle shifts. The streets are still dusty, but children play where once only gunmen strode. School bells ring where only poker chips once clattered. And at the heart of it all stand the mail-order brides, unheralded builders whose work stitched the West into something lasting. The morning light spills over a prairie homestead, and you hear the faint sound of children laughing, a sound that was rare in bachelor towns but grew common once mail-order brides arrived. These children, born of unions between distant strangers, were living proof of the experiment, and more than that, they carried within them a blend of worlds that shaped the next generation of the frontier. Imagine a boy with his father's rough hands and his mother's lilting accent. He grows up herding cattle under the endless western sky, but sings lullabies in German at night because that's what his mother hums. Or picture a girl who learns to cook cornbread from her neighbors, but also kneads rye bread with her mother every Sunday. Their lives stitched together traditions in ways no one back east could have predicted. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some immigrant households, children were given two names, an American name for school and church, and a traditional one for home. One boy might be John to his teacher, but Johann to his mother, switching identities as smoothly as he switched languages. Historians still argue whether these cross-cultural children were embraced as symbols of the melting pot, or shunned as outsiders in their own towns. Some were celebrated for bringing fresh traditions to the frontier. Others endured teasing or prejudice, especially if their mothers came from non-European backgrounds. The debate still lingers in historical accounts. Were they bridges or boundaries? The mainstream fact, census records from the late 19th century show high rates of mixed heritage families in frontier states. German, Irish, Swedish, Mexican, and even Japanese brides all raised children who grew up speaking multiple languages and embodying hybrid identities. These children, often bilingual, became translators not only of words, but of worlds. Picture the household routines. A child helps his father mend fences in the morning, and then watches his mother embroider patterns from the old country in the afternoon. Another child attends a rough, one-room school where lessons are in English, but returns home to prayers whispered in Polish or Norwegian. Their lives are a constant blending, weaving threads of heritage into the rough cloth of American frontier life. Some traditions clashed. One mother insisted on observing saints' feast days with candles and prayers, while neighbors muttered about strange customs. Another raised her children on spicy stews unfamiliar to the settlement, and soon enough half the town acquired a taste for them. Over time, children themselves became the proof that differences could merge into something new. Here's another quirky scene. In one Montana mining town, children of Irish and Swedish brides invented their own playground language, a mix of Gaelic, Swedish, and English words that baffled adults but made perfect sense to them. Their games became a living example of how culture melted and reformed in the mouths of the next generation. Of course, the West was not always kind. Children of Chinese or Mexican brides often faced harsher prejudice, labeled outsiders even if they were born on American soil. Yet many of these same children grew up to be storekeepers, teachers, and ranchers, proving their belonging through persistence, if not through acceptance. And through it all, the children carried their mother's stories. They remembered lullabies, recipes, and sayings that outlived the rough edges of frontier life. Decades later, those memories turned into family legends. Grandma came on a train with nothing but a trunk. Great-grandpa built the house from sod, and Grandma planted roses beside it. So as you watch these children chase each other across the prairie grass, you realize they are the true legacy of the mail-order bride system. They are neither fully of the old world nor entirely of the new, but something in between, something uniquely American. Their laughter is lighter than the hardship, their futures broader than the cabins they grew up in. The prairie quiets after the children's laughter fades, and you notice another sound rising, voices of officials, lawmakers, and bureaucrats trying to make sense of a phenomenon that had grown too large to ignore. For decades, mail-order marriages had been improvised, half-legal, and fueled by personal ads. But as scandals mounted and immigration swelled, the government began to take notice. Imagine a county clerk in Kansas leafing through stacks of marriage certificates, scratching his head. Some were signed in proxy, others mailed in, still others missing altogether. He wonders which ones should be recognized by the state. If a widow seeks her husband's land after his death, what if her marriage was only by correspondence? These questions trickled upward until legislators could no longer avoid them. Here's your quirky tidbit. One legislator once proposed requiring a 3-month waiting period for any marriage arranged by mail, complete with signed letters of intent, as though love were a mining claim needing to be staked and proved. The idea never gained traction, but it shows just how awkward lawmakers felt about putting romance into law books. Historians still argue whether government scrutiny was truly about protecting vulnerable brides or more about controlling immigration and property rights. Some scholars suggest laws were shaped less by concern for women and more by fear of fraud, bigamy, or land disputes. Others point to cases where local judges genuinely tried to safeguard women from being duped. The debate leaves a blurry picture of intent. The mainstream fact here: by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, states began tightening marriage laws, requiring licenses, witnesses, and stricter record-keeping. Meanwhile, immigration laws like the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 specifically targeted Asian women, making it far harder for them to come as brides. These measures reveal that male brides were not just quaint curiosities. They sat at the intersection of policy, prejudice, and power. Picture the hearings. A row of grey-suited men debate whether male marriages destabilize society. Some argue they civilize the frontier, others claim they invite fraud. Meanwhile, actual brides, busy hauling water, cooking meals, and raising children, rarely have a voice in the matter. The law was written about them, but not by them. And yet government scrutiny wasn't all abstract. Postal inspectors sometimes investigated matrimonial agencies suspected of fraud, shutting down the worst offenders. Immigration officials questioned women at ports, demanding proof that their marriages were genuine. These interrogations could be humiliating, forcing women to defend the sincerity of vows made in ink. Here's another quirky scene. One inspector in San Francisco reportedly asked a Japanese bride to recite details of her groom's letters to prove she really knew him. She blushed, repeated his words, "Your hair is like the setting sun." And the inspector, embarrassed, waved her through. Bureaucracy met romance, and romance won that round. But the scrutiny also cast long shadows. Many brides felt trapped between needing the law's recognition and fearing its interference. If their marriages were questioned, they risked losing property, children, or citizenship. For immigrant women especially, the law was less a safety net and more a tightrope. So as you watch the dust rise from courthouse steps, you see the contradiction clearly. Mail-order brides were celebrated in newspapers as curiosities, whispered about in towns as gossip, and eyed by officials as problems to regulate. They were at once cherished partners and suspicious strangers, builders of homes and subjects of policy. Through it all, they endured. They cooked, sewed, bore children, and planted gardens while lawmakers argued over definitions. Their resilience outlasted the debates, reminding you that sometimes history is written not in statutes, but in survival. The courthouse doors close behind you, but the story doesn't stop there. Time keeps rolling, trains keep running, and the idea of finding love, or at least companionship through mail, doesn't vanish with the 19th century. Instead, it mutates, slipping into the 20th century like an old habit dressed in new clothes. Imagine the shift around 1900. The railroads have been tamed, cities have grown, and the Wild West is beginning to look less wild. Yet lonely hearts remain, scattered across farms, boarding houses, and new immigrant neighborhoods. Personal ads still dot the back pages of newspapers, now with photographs more commonly included, and matrimonial bureaus expand their reach. What once looked like a desperate gamble for frontiersmen becomes an urban trend. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the early 1900s, some bureaus advertised themselves with slogans like "Happiness by mail, guaranteed." One even offered refunds if introductions failed, as though marriage could be returned like a defective plough. Customers complained anyway. Apparently, not all brides or grooms met the guarantee. Historians still argue whether the system truly evolved or merely recycled the same old risks. Did urban matrimonial bureaus offer more safety, or did they just professionalize the scams? Evidence shows both. Some unions thrived, while others fell apart spectacularly, keeping newspapers in business with stories of fraud, theft, and mismatched couples. The mainstream fact here, by the 1920s, the rise of Lonely Hearts Clubs formalized the matchmaking process even further. Agencies mailed out printed catalogues of men and women seeking partners, complete with descriptions and sometimes staged photographs. It was less about handwritten letters and more about flipping through a magazine of possibilities, an eerie foreshadowing of dating apps a century later. Picture the evolution. A Kansas farmer in 1870 writes shaky lines to a Boston schoolteacher. By 1910, his son scans a printed catalogue filled with women from Chicago, Philadelphia, even overseas. The format changes, but the longing behind it, the ache for companionship, remains stubbornly the same, and the global reach only grew. Immigrant communities in America wrote back to their homelands requesting brides. Japanese picture brides continued arriving until immigration restrictions tightened. Later, Eastern European women sought husbands across the Atlantic. The flow of letters became a flow of ships, binding continents together in marriages made not by neighbors but by postal routes and bureaucracies. Here's another quirky scene. In the 1930s, a lonely heart scam made headlines when a woman corresponded with dozens of men at once, collecting gifts of money, watches, even livestock promises, before vanishing. She became known as the matrimonial Black Widow, though no actual murders were proven. The drama of the 19th century simply found new costumes, but alongside the frauds were quieter triumphs. Couples who met through letters settled into ordinary lives, raising families, running shops, and rarely making headlines. Their children often never knew that their parents' love began in the margins of a newspaper. As you sit in this new century, the dust of the frontier behind you, you realize the mail-order bride phenomenon didn't die with the Wild West. It just changed address, adapting to telegraphs, railroads, and eventually international shipping routes. The desperation of lonely miners gave way to the loneliness of urban clerks, widows, and immigrants. The human hunger stayed the same. Only the paper, ink, and postage shifted. And so the story rolls forward, the letters multiplying, the scams evolving, and the hope, always the hope, refusing to fade. The prairie fades into memory now, replaced by silver screens and paperbacks. As the West grew tamer, its legends only grew wilder. The real grit of hauling water, patching cabins, and waiting on mailbags was gradually rewritten into tales of romance, danger, and drama. The mail-order bride became less of a flesh-and-blood woman and more of a myth stamped into American culture. Imagine sitting in a dim movie theater in the 1930s. The screen flickers to life, showing a wide prairie, a lonely cowboy, and a train that brings a beautiful woman from back east. She steps off in perfect makeup, her dress spotless despite the dust, and within 20 minutes of screen time, she has either tamed him into a gentleman or been swept into his arms. No mud-chinked cabins, no outhouse smells, no snake dropping down the chimney. Hollywood airbrushed the grit into glamour. Here's your quirky tidbit. One 1950s Western comedy portrayed a male bride who arrived expecting luxury but found herself in a shack. The punchline? She instantly redecorated with lace curtains and taught the cowboy to waltz. The film never mentioned the back-breaking work of hauling water or the loneliness of being miles from neighbors. In the cultural imagination, the hardships quietly vanished. Historians still argue whether these portrayals were harmless entertainment or damaging distortions. Some claim the myths honored women by casting them as civilizing heroines. Others argue they erased the very real suffering and resilience of the actual brides. The debate is less about whether the myths were wrong, they clearly were, and more about what America chose to remember versus what it chose to forget. The mainstream fact, dime novels, pulp magazines, and later Hollywood films helped create the enduring archetype of the mail-order bride as a romantic adventurer. These depictions spread so widely that even today many people know the myth before they know the history. Picture a bookshelf in the mid-20th century stacked with paperbacks, Bride on the Frontier, Prairie Wife, Love by Post. Their covers show glamorous women in flowing gowns gazing at rugged cowboys, sunsets blazing behind them. Inside, the stories follow predictable arcs of conflict, romance, and eventual domestic bliss. For readers, these stories offered escapism. For historians, they offered frustration. How do you recover the truth when fiction sells better? And it wasn't only fiction. The myth filtered into everyday conversation. Mail-order bride became shorthand for desperation or comic relief, a phrase tossed around without recognition of the grit it represented. It was easier to laugh at the idea of a woman stepping off a train in lace gloves than to remember the reality of her scrubbing floors until her hands cracked. Here's another quirky scene. In the late 1970s, a television sitcom used a male bride plotline where the bride turned out to be a con artist. The laugh track roared, the audience chuckled, but in that simplification, Decades of real women's lives were flattened into a punchline. And yet, myths have their power. They kept the image of the male bride alive long after the frontier was gone. They turned anonymous women into archetypes, into symbols of courage, naivete, or comic folly. And while the myths smoothed over the mud and the hardship, they also kept the phenomenon from slipping into total obscurity. So as you sit with this Hollywood-filtered version of history, you notice the distance between what was lived and what was remembered. The real mail-order brides hauled water, buried children, endured winters, and carved communities from nothing. The imagined brides, by contrast, stood radiant in gowns, their biggest challenge solved in a 2-hour plotline. Between those two images lies the strange legacy of the male bride, half truth, half myth, and entirely woven into America's storytelling fabric. The theatre lights dim, the screen fades, and you're left in the quiet again, wondering what really remains once the myths are stripped away. For every Hollywood sunset, there are boxes of old letters, census records, and diaries that tell of a more complicated truth. Scholars have spent decades sifting through these scraps, trying to answer a question that refuses to settle. Were mail-order brides victims of circumstance, or were they pioneers forging their own destiny? Imagine a historian hunched over a brittle diary in an archive, the ink fading but legible enough to read lines like, "I miss my sisters, yet I cannot say, I regret coming." Another letter reads, "I feel trapped, but I endure for the children." Each voice pulls the debate in a different direction. Were these words of resignation or resilience? Here's your quirky tidbit. One 20th century scholar claimed that most male brides were duped innocents, only to be challenged by another historian who pointed out letters from women who clearly stated, "I chose this life, I wanted land." The academic spat grew so heated that a conference once scheduled a panel called Brides, Victims, or Visionaries, proving that even decades later the arguments still have bite. The mainstream fact is this: the evidence is mixed. Some women undoubtedly suffered, trapped in abusive marriages, isolated or deceived by false promises. Others thrived, becoming landowners, teachers, and matriarchs of families that prospered. The same system produced both outcomes, which makes blanket statements impossible. Historians still argue whether the very framework of the system was inherently exploitative, or if it simply reflected the hard bargains of the frontier. Was it a market of desperation, where men bought companionship and women sold survival? Or was it an early form of agency, where women carved paths otherwise denied to them in rigid Eastern societies? Picture the contrast. In one cabin, a woman weeps at night, regretting every word she wrote in her letters. In another, a bride proudly surveys the schoolhouse she helped establish, her name etched in the cornerstone. Both lives existed, both sprang from the same mailbag. And then there are the voices missing altogether. Many brides never wrote diaries or letters that survived. Their stories are silent, leaving historians to piece together fragments and guess at motives. Silence itself becomes part of the debate. Was it silence of contentment or silence of despair, too deep to record? Here's another quirky scene. One researcher stumbled upon a trunk of letters in a Wyoming attic, hundreds of them, unsent drafts written by a bride who agonized over every word before posting the final version. The drafts revealed her doubts, her sarcasm, even her jokes, none of which appeared in the polished letters she mailed. It's a reminder that what we read as history is often the edited version of truth. And so the arguments continue. Some call these women exploited, others call them trailblazers. Maybe both are true, depending on which cabin you step into, which letter you unfold. As you sit with the echoes of those debates, you realize that history rarely hands out neat verdicts. Instead, it leaves us with questions, contradictions, and the quiet certainty that real lives resist tidy categories. The mail-order brides were neither purely tragic nor purely triumphant. They were human, messy, complicated, flawed, and brave. The wind outside softens now, less a howl than a whisper, as if the prairie itself knows the story is winding down. You've walked alongside men scribbling awkward letters, women clutching faded photographs, trains screeching into depots, and cabins filled with both laughter and silence. The tale of the mail-order brides was never simple, part desperation, part opportunity, part survival, part love. Imagine one last evening in a frontier town. The lamps are lit, the streets quiet, and inside a cabin, a woman tucks her children into bed. She once stepped off a train, unsure of what she would find, and now the walls are covered with her quilts, the shelves lined with jars. She filled herself, the room alive with warmth she built out of nothing. She is no myth, no headline, no dime novel heroine, just a person who endured and created a life. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some families today, descendants still keep bundles of those first letters, yellowed with age, tied in ribbon. They're read aloud at reunions like family scripture, proof that entire bloodlines began with a gamble sealed in ink. Historians still argue whether to call these women victims of a harsh system or pioneers who bent it to their will. You can feel the tug-of-war in every diary entry, every census record. Yet maybe the answer lies not in choosing one label, but in admitting both can be true at once. The mainstream fact is undeniable. Without these women, many Western towns would have withered. They brought stability, children, schools, businesses, and community. They stitched civilization into a landscape that otherwise might have remained a restless camp of bachelors. And so the legacy lingers, not in myths of brides stepping daintily off trains into romance, nor in the scandals splashed across newspaper headlines, but in the quiet endurance that shaped families, farms, and futures. Their story is less about spectacle and more about persistence, written in calloused hands, patched dresses, and the laughter of children chasing chickens across yards. Now the pace slows, the fire burns low, the prairie night deepens, and your breathing steadies as the last echoes fade. The story of the mail-order brides settles into silence, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the calm weight of ordinary lives remembered. So close your eyes now, let the long trains fade into distant whistles, the scratch of quills quiet into nothing, the clatter of saloons melt into stillness. Picture wide skies above cabins, roses climbing rough fences, and women rocking children to sleep while coyotes howl in the distance. The frontier is calmer now, its rough edges softened by time. Rest easy knowing these brides, once strangers on paper, left behind more than marriages. They left behind roots, quiet, stubborn, and enduring, that still anchor the stories of families today. And as you drift off, hold on to this. History isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the hush of a letter folded carefully, the creak of a cabin door closing, the steady rhythm of two lives carrying on together. Sleep well, sweet dreams.